would it be in the event page or on the All right, welcome everyone. Hi there. Okay. Hi everyone, welcome to the Del Valley Community Coalition's third Facebook Live session. I'm Vanessa Fuentes, Communications Liaison for the Del Valley Community Coalition. And today we have two very special guests joining us. We have our Mayor Pro Tem, Delia Garza, and Shoshana Krieger with Basta Austin. First, I want to give a brief bio on our special guest, Mayor Pro Tem Delia Garza. She was first elected to Austin City Council in November 2014 as part of Austin's first 10-1 council. She was re-elected in November of 2016 and was elected by her colleagues to serve as Mayor Pro Tem in January 2019. Garza was the first Latina to serve on the City Council in Austin, and she's the first Latina to serve as Austin's Mayor Pro Tem. She represents District 2 in Southeast Austin, which overlaps with the majority of Del Valley ISD, including the city and annex boundaries. We're also joined by Shoshana Krieger. Shoshana Krieger is the project director for Building and Strengthening Tenant Action, also known as BASTA, at Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid. BASTA organizes Austin renters to work with their neighbors to ensure that all Austinites have access to safe and affordable housing by facilitating the development of tenant associations and supporting those associations with legal representation. BASTA targets slumlords who profit off of renting substandard properties, the conditions of which negatively impact families. Thank you all both for joining us today. And as a reminder to everyone who is tuning in live, you are more than welcome to ask questions. In fact, we encourage you to ask questions. We're going to go through a lot today, so please feel free to type in any questions that you have throughout the conversation, and we will get to them in the last 15 minutes of today's conversation. All right, so hi everyone. Again, I'm Vanessa Fuentes, and we are joined today by Mayor Pro Tem Delia Garza and Shoshana Krieger. Welcome to our Del Valley community. I first wanted to toss it over to our guest to say a few special remarks. And first up, we'll have our Mayor Pro Tem, if you'd like to offer some welcome remarks.
Hi, well, good evening, Facebook and Del Valley. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to participate in this very important presentation about tenants' rights. You know, one thing that we all believe to be very clear is that the current situation and pandemic has magnified many of the inequities that we already know existed in our city. And many of you may have heard this story that I've told before, but I remember, I believe it was my second year on the city council, and it's when some of the flooding was happening in the Los Cielos neighborhood. And it was on Halloween Day, and my staff went out to just knock on doors and ask if people were okay. Much of the flooding was already over, but people were, pulling their furniture out of their front door. And I asked, what do you need most from the city right now? And we were told, dumpsters. Can you just bring dumpsters? Because they had all these possessions that were wet and they were just trying to get them, pulling them out into the curb. And so I remember I called, he's no longer an assistant city manager. And I said, we need, how do I get dumpsters out to Del Valley, as quickly as possible? And I gave the address and he said, that's not in the city of Austin. And I said, I know it's in the city of Austin because, during my campaign, I block walked this neighborhood. I know this is in the city of Austin. And I sent him the address again and he said, we'll get dumpsters out there tomorrow morning. And they in fact did. And so I was quickly made aware of an area neglected by the city. And so we've been working hard to change that. And so many of the issues that I've heard from Del Valley is, number one, has always been the grocery store. It has been the nut that we have found so difficult to crack, but we continue to work with HEB and other grocery stores to try to bring that food access to Del Valley. I think one of the big wins we had recently, and I just got invited to the groundbreaking of the fire station in July, towards the end of July. We were told that there would not be a fire station in that area for another 10 years. I think it took about 3 resolutions, and we finally were able to get the funding to get that fire station that will open in July. It may already actually be, they might have an engine in there already, but in the interim, we were able to get the toll house, the fire station on the toll house staffed with firefighters, because we had heard that people's insurance rates were going up because they were too far from a fire station. And so everybody deserves equal access to the public safety services in our city. We've worked on early childhood, and I haven't had as much of an opportunity to get to know the newest superintendent at Del Valle ISD. I've met her a couple times, but then, in this current situation, we haven't been able to have so many meetings. But the previous superintendent, she was really good in elevating the issues and texting me and telling me, what about Del Valle? What about Del Valle? And when we recently funded some early childhood classrooms, pre-K3, for AISD, we also did it for Del Valle ISD as well. And so there's a lot more work to do, and I'm grateful to be here today to talk about tenants' rights. And I'm so glad that we have one of the experts in that area joining us to give us all of the information. It's taken a network of different regulations from different governmental entities to give so many protections right now, and really there are protections that should have been there to begin with. But the silver, lining in any of the current situation right now is that we are seeing so much movement in ways and quicker than we have seen before. And so I think it's important to use this moment to understand how different government entities can work together to give people the basic right to housing, which is a human right. And so I'm grateful to be here and answer any questions, and happy that Shoshana is here to answer specific questions to tenants' rights. So thank you, Vanessa.
Wonderful. Thank you. And thank you for your service. That was a perfect segue into our next guest. Shoshana, would you like to say a few welcome remarks?
Sure. First, thanks so much for having me on tonight. And I am honored to share this Zoom stage, I guess we could call it a stage, with the Mayor Pro Tem. I echo a lot of the remarks of the Mayor Pro Tem, although my knowledge of Del Valle is much more limited. And we have not BASA. We organize tenants throughout Austin to fight to get repairs, mostly multifamily properties, mobile home parks. We have yet to have the privilege to work with an apartment complex or mobile home park in Del Valle. So if you're out there and you want to organize with your neighbors, give us a call. We would love to learn about and know your community deeper. We do know a lot about tenants' rights in Austin in this moment. As the Mayor Pro Tem said, right now there are lots of changes to rights and to protections, and it's a bit confusing, and we'll do the best today to walk folks through this process. But we're also here to answer questions later on. You can give BASA a call. I know you can give city council members offices calls as well to help you navigate it. So just very quickly, a little bit more about BASA. As I said, we organize tenants associations. We're working with over a dozen right now in Austin. And we support tenants associations in doing what the residents at properties want to do and kind of taking on the issues which the residents want to take on. And so that will look different from property to property. And so one example of work we've done is with Paisano Mobile Home Park, where the residents had a manager who was bullying them, and they successfully were able to get the manager to step down. Another example is around substandard housing and getting repairs, where we got mold remediation. A final one is in North Austin. We just worked with mobile home park residents to actually purchase their property and run it as a co-op. So we do a little bit of everything, whatever tenants want. And we believe in the power of collective action and of organized groups to be able to shift power, because in Texas, tenants have very few rights. And so oftentimes, while we know what is moral, that the moral right may not equate with the legal right. And so we believe that organizing allows us to achieve things sometimes, which unfortunately the laws in Texas don't protect. And also organizing has the power to change what rights and protections tenants have. So I'm excited to talk about tenants' rights issues right now. And I also echo what the Mayor Pro Tem said about this being a moment in time where we have an opportunity and we are seeing things we have not seen before in Texas. And there is an opportunity to keep that moving past this pandemic. We're also on the cusp, and we'll talk about this in a minute, of potentially a second man-made public health crisis, which is a potential eviction crisis. And we as a city and a community have the power to stop that because it's man-made and it's also 100% preventable. And we're in a moment of time where we can do that. And so I hope that we walk away from today feeling like we actually have the power to prevent that from happening.
Absolutely. Thank you. And that's a great segue into what I'm about to say, is that part of our Del Valley Community Coalition is we want to organize and do just that, bring power to our community so that we're informed, we know what's going on, and we're able to successfully advocate for priorities for our area. So thank you both for joining us today and to discuss the topic of tenants' rights with a focus on evictions. Today's conversation, we'll be going over the typical eviction process and how it's changed since the pandemic with local and federal tenant protections. There's been a lot going on, as previously mentioned, so we're going to dive right into figuring out what those protections entail and what that means for you. Importantly, we will also talk about the upcoming moratorium deadline and what residents should do should you be facing eviction. We will be taking questions at the end as a reminder, so please feel free to pop them right in. We have moderators who will be letting us know the questions as they come in, and we'll take them in the last 15 minutes of today's conversation. And before we give a recap on recent events, we want to remind everyone real quick, if we can put the map up of Del Valley, that Del Valley is, as you can see, an expansive part of Travis County. Our Del Valley community is both within the city of Austin limits, and we're also within the ETJ of the county, which means that some of our Del Valley community members will have protections from the city of Austin, and others will have protections from Travis County. And this makes our community diverse, not only in geography, but also in that we are both urban and rural. So we're a great community and we have a lot going on. And we always like to bring this map out so that we can help showcase how expansive Del Valley is, and that it's northeast and southeast Travis County, so that people are able to have a good visual of what we talk about when we say Del Valley. So with that out of the way, let's go over a quick recap on current events. We know that courts in Texas have restarted eviction cases, or they did for a little bit. But now what we want to make sure to highlight is that here in Austin, renters are still protected. The city of Austin and Travis County have enacted protections that are supposed to protect tenants from eviction during this global pandemic. These protections include that landlords may not give notices to vacate except in situations involving physical harm or criminal activity. Renters have the right to pay back rent payments for 60 days until August 24th. And the CARES Act bans late fees if you live in a unit that has a federally backed mortgage. Now, I know I just said a lot there. That's a lot to unpack, but don't worry, because we got you covered, and we have the experts that are going to talk us through so that you're able to be informed about your rights and empowered to make your voice heard and engage in the process. So our first question will go to our Mayor Pro Tem. And if you could talk us through, Mayor Pro Tem, if you could talk us through why tenants' rights is an important topic for us to be discussing at this very moment.
Sure. We're seeing record unemployment because of the pandemic. I will say that tenants' rights are important to talk about at any moment, but now more than ever, again, like I said, it's great to see that these issues are rising to a level that people are paying attention to. And so, as the city government, we are so limited in so many ways on how to be able to address evictions. Much of it is guided by state law, and we do what we can on the city side, but there's so many that mesh of different kinds of laws and court systems that need to come together and able to put us in a position to really protect tenants' rights. And so District 2 is one of the lower income districts in Austin. The median income for a family of 4 in the city on average is about 85 to 90,000, and the median income for a family of 4 is about 50,000 for District 2. And so we see, I've jokingly said that we are fiscal conservatives in District 2 because we have to be. We have to be very conscious about how we spend our money. And we know every day, even before the pandemic, families were making choices between keeping their lights on or paying their rent. And that was before the pandemic. And now families have lost, and it's hitting District 2 more because we have a lot of hospitality workers in this district, food and beverage workers. And when there is no tourism industry essentially happening, many people in District 2 have lost their jobs. And so, now more than ever, it's great to see, like Supreme Courts that are majority conservative stepping in and recognizing that access to housing is a basic human right and doing things. And so I'm grateful that we do have all these different things melding together, but now more than ever, we have record unemployment and families. And right now in a pandemic, when you're supposed to be trying to stay at home and social distance, the last thing we need is families being, kicked out of their homes, which not only obviously exposes them to a variety of things, one being COVID-19, but the fact of being homeless as well. And so incredibly important topic at any moment, but right now, especially because under the current conditions. And many of these conditions are not the fault of the families. This is a unprecedented time that we're in, and nobody, and I think many people are just now realizing that we could be in this situation for a while. When we're seeing some of these numbers go up in positive rates and hospitalizations, and the fact that the Latino community is affected even more, there's disparities all over, and they were always there, and now we're seeing them even more, that the Latino community, and we are the essential workers. We are the ones that when restaurants open up, we are the ones working there. When construction sites were allowed to open back up, it is Latinos who are out working at those jobs too. So we are being exposed more, and we all need to know that, and I need to know, and I'm sure every one of you needs to know that our families have a place to go home to at the end of the day, to be safe and to have shelter.
Absolutely. Housing as a fundamental right. And thank you for talking about some of the experiences of our community and how what is going on right now in the pandemic has been magnified and compounded by all the different layers and the struggles that our community is facing. And so knowing that someone might be put in the situation to be without a home is horrifying to think about, absolutely horrifying. And so if you could talk us through, how do recently implemented policies that increase tenant protections, how does that help during this time?
Well, it sets up different timelines that allow people to stay in their homes. And so, having an eviction on your record will follow you, many times for the rest of your life. Shoshana can probably speak to how long that affects your ability to rent. But, it's a big problem in general. I'm looking at the question again, sorry, because my little one was running around. Implemented. Oh, so yeah, they just allow you to, they prevent somebody for the government from being able to evict you from your home. And I just saw recently, even though some of the county courts did start having hearings again, it was the work of BASTA that were having witnesses. You could sign up to witness what was going on, to not only for, you know, an average person to understand what that process is, but to also bring awareness to that process. And I, in fact, signed up for one of those and wasn't able to access it, but then was, what I believe, got an email saying that they've stopped the hearings again. So, I mean, I think that's a perfect example of squeaky wheel gets the grease, right? And so before the pandemic, we didn't have this attention being given to this issue, and now because of this, we see this attention being given to this very important issue, and it has applied, frankly, political pressure and needed political pressure to every you know, level, whether it be city, whether it be state, whether it be the judicial. To really provide more flexibility for families during this time.
Wonderful, thank you. All right, so we kind of teed up the topic, the conversation around evictions. And so now we're gonna dive right in with our resident expert, so Shauna. So if you can please walk us through what exactly is a typical eviction process and what happens when one is not able to pay rent?
Sure, I would be happy to. So the first thing, if you go to next slide, please. So the first thing, before we get into the formal eviction process, I want to talk a little bit about the difference between what's a formal eviction and an informal eviction. And a formal eviction is what we tend to think about when we think of an eviction, right? That you go into court and a judge says, you are hereby evicted. And there's a process. And that's where we kind of have data. We know more or less what to expect. It's not always the same, but there's a process. But there's this other category of evictions, which housing justice folks around the country are talking a lot about, which are informal evictions. And those are evictions when a tenant moves out under verbal or written threat of eviction, but the courts aren't involved. And most housing scholars think that informal evictions may happen even more often than formal evictions. This is when a manager says, if you don't like it, then you should just move and you got to get out by the end of the week. And the family is scared and they move. Or when someone comes home and there's a notice to vacate on their door and they look at it and they may think they're in the right, but they're just like, I don't want this on my record. And so they move out. And so those are all those informal evictions, which we aren't talking about in this moment, but we just want to recognize exist because that is the reality of being a tenant. And that is something which is really important that we shine light on because we can't capture the data in numbers, right? Every time someone moves out of their house because their manager bullies them out, it's not like there's a data collector being like, check, like now another person informally evicted. But that's something in that culture, and that culture which allows landlords to just push tenants out in that way. And the lack of education that tenants have in awareness, which we as a community have provided to tenants about their rights to stand up and fight it, is something which can be corrected. So now we'll go into the formal eviction process. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is quick, nitty gritty, not going to get into all of the details, all of the if this, then that of this process, but just to locate us all on what are the basic steps, because these steps are really useful in understanding where the protections are going to come into play when we start talking about the protections. So a typical eviction process starts, and this is a process if you don't pay your rent. There are other lease violations which can result in eviction. The vast majority of cases, though, which we see are non-payment of rent cases. So the first step is that a landlord gives a tenant a notice to vacate. And this is a notice which normally is on the inside of the door. It could be handed directly to the tenant or it could be mailed, which gives a tenant But under state law, it has to be at least 3 days to move out, but a contract can shorten that to 1 day. So the Texas Apartment Association lease, which is the lease most landlords who we work with use, that shortens it to 1 day. So it says, hey, you have 1 day and you need to move out. And if you don't move out, we're going to file an eviction. During that day, you could run to your landlord saying, hey, landlord, I have all of the money. And the landlord could say, nah, I don't want it, and proceed with the eviction, because there's not what's called an opportunity to cure, an opportunity to catch up. A lot of times the landlord will say, sure, I don't want to go through this process, but there's nothing making them do it. The next step is, if you don't move out in the 1 day or the 3 days, is that the landlord can then go to the local justice court, which is the Justice of the Peace Court, and file an eviction against you. And after they file an eviction against you, then a constable, so an officer of the court, is going to go out and they're going to serve you with the papers. So you'll get official papers from the court. And so it's important here to know that it's going to be a constable giving you the papers. If they try a few times, then there's a way that you can get the papers without being served by the constable, but it's not the landlord. So if all you did was receive papers from just your landlord or your manager or someone who works for them, then those aren't official court papers. The official court papers will come from the constable. And so that the constable's papers will tell you the date of a hearing, and where you can show up if you want to defend yourself in the eviction case. And so the next step then is that eviction hearing. And that hearing happens in justice court. And generally in Texas, if you're found to owe rent, you're gonna lose. This is not like other states where there are defenses to evictions because there are major repair issues or the landlord didn't do certain things. In Texas, those aren't defenses. So if you are found to owe rent, you are more than likely going to lose the case. But you cannot be evicted until there's a court order, and then the next step happens. So that's also really important to know, that only a court can be the one to order you evicted. So if you lose, then you have 5 days, which you can appeal to county court. And if you appeal to county court, then the clock resets. There's a process you have to pay into a court registry or pay a bond and whatnot, but that kind of can prolong things more. Or if you decide to move out, you can just move out and that's that. And then if you don't move out after 5 days, the landlord can ask for what's called a writ of possession, which is that they will have a constable go out to your house and then forcibly remove you. And you'll get a notice from the constable saying that you have a day to move out. And then if you don't move out, the constable will come in and take all of your belongings and put them to the curb. And this process normally lasts between 3 and 5 weeks in Travis County. So it's pretty quick in normal times. Next slide.
Wow. And, as we're walking through it, I couldn't help but think that, for the moment you receive the first notice, you're expected to vacate within days, in some cases 1 day. And that is just not a humane way to go about it. And so it is pretty shocking to hear about how the process works. So with, now that we've...
that isn't something which is the case in other states. In other states, that period of time is longer. And so that's something that, while it exists right now in Texas, just generally, that's not the world we have to live in.
That's a great point. Thank you. Thank you for bringing that, because we want to learn about the system first, right? And then join BASTA in organizing to change the system for sure. So the next thing we wanted to ask you about is, now that we know about the process, can you walk us through the changes that we've seen since the pandemic? What are the new timelines? What are some of the rights that we now have because we're in a state of pandemic?
Sure. If we can go to the next slide. Okay. So when we talk about the changes, and there's a lot of them, so bear with me. There are kind of three main buckets which I use to think about the changes. There are changes which come from the courts, so which alter the process I just laid out. Kind of once that process begins, it affects that process. Then there are changes which are through the federal government from the Federal CARES Act, which we'll talk about. And then there are changes which are local action, changes which come from local government. In Travis County and City of Austin, it's mainly Travis County and the City of Austin. So we'll talk about each of those three buckets. Next slide. Okay, so for court orders, this slide used to be much more complicated. Then it got very simple, and now it's like a little bit complicated because everything is changing. So that's the other thing in thinking about these changes. If I were to be speaking with you a week and a day ago, things would be different than right now. So it's important to just make sure you're up to date on the latest information because things will change day to day. So for court orders, the Supreme Court of Texas had an order which basically prevented the vast majority of evictions in the state of Texas from proceeding, but that expired back in May, on May 18th. So that's no longer in effect. Williamson County also had a moratorium on evictions, which also I believe has expired. I haven't heard anything changing that, although that is something which could be happening. Travis County had a moratorium which expired on June 1st, and then there was 2 weeks of evictions, and then just last week they reimposed the moratorium on evictions. So that means that right now in Travis County there cannot be eviction hearings except for in cases where there's an imminent threat of harm or criminal activity until July 22nd. So a month from today. So that means that landlords can still file an eviction case, but that there won't be that hearing, which is necessary before an eviction judgment can be issued. The other thing that the Travis County Justice Courts announced last week is that there will be no writs of possession executed or issued. So that means the court won't grant a writ of possession, and they also won't send a constable out to actually kick you out of your apartment until July 29th. So that basically is going to prevent most evictions from being carried out in Travis County, except for in cases of imminent threat of criminal activity. Next slide. Okay. Then the next set of protections which tenants have come through the Federal CARES Act, and these protections don't apply to all Austin renters. They apply to renters who live in either federally subsidized housing or federally supported housing. And what federally subsidized housing is, the federal government is giving money or subsidy to the properties, normally in exchange for affordable housing. So that would be low-income housing tax credits, that would be project-based Section 8, that would be public housing. This other bucket, federally supported housing, is kind of a new list which has been created at the federal government. And this is all housing where the federal government is involved in the financing. So it could just be that they're backing the mortgage of the properties. So Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are two big government.
Oh, Shoshana, we got you on mute. There we go.
Sorry, my computer does a weird thing. Okay, I'm back. You're good? Okay. So any property in which the federal government is involved in its mortgage also is protected under the CARES Act. But because this hasn't been a bucket, which normally no one talks about, federally supported housing has X rights, there is no comprehensive list of what properties are covered under the CARES Act. So in order to try to compile that list, housing advocates from across the country have been scrambling. BASTA, Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid, Texas Housers, we put together a map, which we think is most multifamily housing, which is covered. We think that potentially up to 60% of Austin rental units are covered. The main thing which is not on the map is 1 to 4 unit properties. No one has a list of that. But the city of Austin did just pass an ordinance which allows a tenant to ask in writing whether the property is covered, and then the landlord has to respond. So if you go to the map, which we have on our website, you search your property and that it will walk you through the steps to confirm it or to send a letter. And we have template letters to help you along that process. If you're covered under the CARES Act, you're in a property covered under the CARES Act, until after July 25th, you can't get notices to vacate. So that very first step of eviction, there can't be an eviction filing. And very importantly, you can't be issued late fees. And so this is the only protection you're going to have against late fees in Austin, is if you live in one of these properties. And we have heard from a number of tenants who live in these properties who've been charged late fees, and that's illegal. And that again brings up this: what's illegal doesn't mean it's not happening. A right is only so good as you're able to effectuate it or enforce it. So it's very important to know what your rights are, and then to reach out to folks to be able to support you in your advocacy. One additional thing for CARES Act properties is that if your non-payment was from April or May or June or July, they have to give you 30 days in your notice to vacate. So instead of that 1 or 3 days, it's going to be 30 days, which means the soonest they can start an eviction is August 24th. Next slide. Okay, so finally, city and county action. There's a mayoral and county judge order on notices to vacate, which is similar to the CARES Act, no notices to vacate. So until July 25th, you as a tenant should not be receiving that notice to vacate, which is the step before the going into court. Also, there should not be any lockouts or landlord's liens, because in Texas, a landlord actually is able to go into your house and steal your TV if they allege that you are late on rent, and that is allowed. But until July 25th, that is no longer allowed in Austin. Again, there is a difference between what the law says and what landlord behavior is, which is why it's important that if you are in the city of Austin and you are experiencing these violations, reach out to advocates and also call 311, because the city code department is the one who should be supporting tenants in enforcing these laws. Another city action, and this just applies to the city of Austin, it's not folks who live in Travis County who don't live in the city of Austin, is an opportunity to cure. So that means that landlords have to give you 60 days to be able to repay your rent for any rent which is owed from March 28th through August 24th. And the process for that is they have to give you a notice of proposed eviction, which would be a notice which was before that notice to vacate, which says you have 60 days to repay. And then once the 61st day happens, that's when they can move forward with the notice to vacate, if they're allowed to, depending on if mayor's orders get extended. And so it's 60 days to repay rent. But one important thing to note is they have to give the notice of proposed eviction. So if you don't pay on if you didn't pay on April 1st, and now we're June 22nd, you still have more than 60 days to repay, because your 60-day clock doesn't start ticking until you get the magic notice of proposed eviction. The ordinance itself expires August 24th. So August 24th, that may be your like kind of end date. What's also important to know about everything which we're talking about is none of this means that you don't have to pay rent. This doesn't mean that your rent is canceled. This doesn't mean you don't have to pay. If you're not in a CARES Act property, they can charge you late fees. So all of this is giving time, and time is very important here. Time lets the social safety net catch up. Time lets the city council pass things like rental assistance and direct financial assistance and all of those things, which can hopefully help people. But all it's giving you is time, which also means that if you have the money to pay, it's probably good to pay so that you're not getting yourself into a hole, which you may not be able to get out of, because many of these protections will be going away. Next slide.
Next slide.
Next slide. Yes. Okay. Okay, this is everything together, which is a little bit intense, and so people can read it at their leisure. This kind of is just everything which has occurred from March 13th, which was our initial eviction moratorium, and then the dates when the other ordinances were put into place. But if you look at kind of after June 16th, which is where the Travis County JP eviction moratorium reimposed, you see right before it, we had a kind of first set of evictions. And so that was kind of our first little wave. And what we're expecting is that on July 25th, when the notice to vacate orders are up, that's really when we're expecting the big second wave. The courts will be open if nothing changes, and landlords who have alleged rent from April will be able to proceed. So we're expecting a first wave. Then on August 24th, we're going to be expecting a third wave of evictions, because those are going to be those CARES Act properties whose protections are up. And so that's going to be kind of an additional number of evictions. So if nothing changes, this is kind of what we expect the world to look like. Of course, it might change, especially if our COVID numbers are going up. We might be in a state of crisis that a lot of this is extended. Next slide.
Good deal. Thank you, Shoshana. A lot of great information there. You mentioned that we have time on our side for now. Time has been given. But what about the money? And if we can have our Mayor Pro Tem come back and talk us through what has the City of Austin enacted to help Austinites who need financial assistance.
Sure. So like I mentioned before, we've seen so many things move very quickly that would have taken, frankly, weeks, if not months to do. So for example, we knew that there was a huge amount of rental assistance needed before COVID. And, when the pandemic really hit our community hard, my office, along with council members, Kassar, Flanagan, I think it was Madison, Hopper Madison, and maybe Renteria, created the RISE Fund. And it was specifically to provide direct financial assistance, as well as assistance for food. Some people got debit cards, some people got direct assistance through their bank accounts. We used the current safety nets that we already have in place. We took a week to talk to staff to figure out how do we get this funding out the quickest to help people, because we knew April's rent was coming due. We started having this conversation about mid-May. I'm sorry, April, because we knew May's rent was coming up. And so, I mean, we were able to get a $15 million addition to that, a creation to that RISE Fund, which was huge. Moving $15 million is not something that you can do very easily. And then when we passed with the CARES funding, which was, I believe, a total of $170 million that went directly to the City of Austin, we created different buckets. And so we were able to see the need when what RISE was created. There was the rent program that was also created, and then different buckets to help people to apply for. And we added funding for RISE. I think we added almost 10 million. The 1.7 million in the rent bucket specifically for rental assistance is, I believe, at about 17 million, but that we wanted to keep all the CARES Act funding very nimble, because we don't know what's coming. We don't know if there's going to be another federal infusion of money, which is desperately needed. But leading up to the passage of the CARES Act, you were seeing it in the news almost every day that it was coming, I haven't really seen that in a second wave of federal stimulus money. And so a lot of families were left out of that CARES, some people were not eligible for that kind of funding. And so that's why the city was able to create these buckets, and not all of it was funded through the CARES Act. It was funded through the city's reserve. We had an actual surplus in our reserve. We have a policy that we keep a certain percentage in our reserve for specifically for emergencies. And unlike the state, we use it's essentially our rainy day fund, and essentially we actually use it because we saw the need to use that. And so there's significant funding available through the CARES Act, and families are getting help. Some families have gotten up to $2,000. Some nonprofits, were able to kind of customize the need for the family. Maybe it was just, $500 that they needed, but we have been able to boost rental assistance, and we do know that the need is very big. The need is big. We do have limited resources, but in creating the RISE Fund, I reached out to, at that time, County Judge Eckhart to ask specifically if the county could maybe match us, in creating the RISE Fund, what they could create. They were able to create some emergency funding, but I believe most of their funding is for people in the county and not in the city, which applies to this part of Austin as well, because there are many people in Del Valle that are not in the city limits, but in the county. And so we're still waiting to see. There was additional funding allocated for rent, specifically rental assistance, and the city's deciding how to roll that out, because it went, the first process was a lottery system, and there's pros and cons to every system. Usually funding from the city is a first come first serve kind of thing, and there's an argument that that's not necessarily fair, because not every family can sit at their computer and log in exactly. It's like getting, when you were, I'm showing my age here, but Ticketmaster, everyone got in line to get their tickets, and it's a first come first serve kind of basis, and there is inequities in that kind of process. And so then they created the lottery system, but then there were also some issues with the lottery system. So they're still trying to figure out and learn from the initial disbursement of funds, a better way to make sure that we are any process includes equity as part of that process.
Yes, absolutely. All right, so we have about 15 minutes left, and we still have about 4 questions to get through. So if we could take these last few questions quickly, that'd be great, because I want to make sure we have time to take questions from the audience that have come in. Shoshana, can you walk us through the hidden data? You mentioned that even though cases may get dismissed, there's still fees, and we're still on the line for fees. So can you talk us through what the process is there, or what we should know about, and then also if evictions stay on your record?
Sure. Okay, next slide. I will try to speed through this. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is just a little bit about the history of eviction filings in Austin over the last 6 years, so 2014 to 2019. And you can see that they've been steadily increasing, especially between 2017, 2018, and then 2018 and 2019. The kind of mustard color are cases which were dismissed, and then the brown color are cases where there's a judgment. So judgment normally means that an eviction actually occurred, although judgments can be in favor of tenants sometimes, but that doesn't, we don't have data right now which accurately captures that, but the vast majority of cases, tenants lose. Dismissed cases, we don't always know what happened to them. Sometimes tenants settle with their landlords, pay court costs and other things, and stay. Sometimes tenants just move out and the landlord chooses not to proceed with the case. But you can see it's kind of split 50-50. Next slide. So this is evictions by Justice of the Peace Precinct. We have 5 in Travis County, and you can see them in the map next to the graph. The colors in the graph correspond to the colors on the map. You can see JP2 and JP1 both have had a pretty high increases in evictions, the steepest increases in evictions from 2018 to 2019. And so that's North Austin and East Austin. Next slide. So one thing that BASTA has done is we're part of the Eviction Solidarity Network, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute, but we're witnessing evictions and tracking evictions. The Mayor Pro Tem referenced some of the stuff we're doing earlier. And one of the things that Eviction Solidarity Network has done is we've created a eviction dashboard, which updates regularly, and it's tracking evictions in 2020. So as of Friday, there were almost 3,000 evictions which have been filed. There were 233 hearings scheduled when the courts shut down. And there were 377 active cases. And so you can visit this whenever you'd like. Next slide, please. So these were the hearings which would have happened had the moratorium not been in effect, 233. And 339 evictions have been filed since March 13th when the initial moratorium went into effect. Next slide. So this is eviction filings by date over in 2020. The chart on the far chart, I think, is particularly instructive because you see that evictions went up, and then there was a moratorium, and then it flattens, and it is flat, and we can keep that curve flat if we want to keep that curve flat. You can see it's like going up a little bit right now in May and June, right? But we have the power to keep that curve flat. So what part of our Eviction Solidarity Network, Eviction is Not a Cure campaign, is to say, keep the curve flat. And then you can also see eviction filings by day just in a bar graph, and it basically, they spike in the middle of every month. And then it goes down because normally landlords will wait like 10 days and then we'll start the process. Next slide. And then this is also on our dashboard. It's evictions by Justice of the Peace precinct. And you can see actually here, it's interesting because JP1 and JP4 were the two precincts which had the most cases in the first 2 weeks. And you can see they have fewer in progress cases than the other JPs, and JP5 didn't hear a single case, and so that's one of the reasons why they have the highest, the largest percentage of cases in progress. Next slide.
Awesome, thank you. All right, so for our next question, Mayor Pro Tem, if you could talk us through, we've talked about the tools that our local leaders have done to help us get through this pandemic, but talk us through, like, what is not in your toolbox? What are the tools that you wish you had access to but don't as a local leader? In other words, what can the state of Texas do to protect tenants?
Sure. Well, first we need leadership that cares about tenants, but aside from that, we one of the main questions I get asked often in town halls, and it's become my first slide because I would get asked about it so much, is why won't the city implement rent control? And it's because we are prohibited by state law from doing that. Other states are able to do that, New York, California, and rent control is essentially your rent can't go above a certain amount. And my constituents are often shocked, like, oh, but it's the truth. Other things are, when we are approving zoning cases, we can get into legal issues if we are asking for affordable housing. If it appears we are asking for affordable housing in exchange for agreeing to a development, we cannot do that. And in fact, if it gets anywhere close to that conversation happening on the dais, usually our city attorney will say, we should go into executive session, which then reminds people that we're not supposed to be doing that kind of trading. We cannot require affordable housing in things. We can do things like when it comes to density bonuses. So we can trade in a way when we're giving a little bit more. And so if we're giving extra height, then we can ask for things in exchange for that. One of the difficult things is that if, let's say, for example, a high-rise downtown, and just because the way the numbers will work out, even if we were to require a certain amount of affordable housing in that building, the reality is we can maybe get 2 or 3 units downtown, but that could translate to maybe 10 units somewhere else. And so it's constantly this trade-off in that it's important for families to be able to live throughout the city, wherever, have access to walkable communities. But then you also want to make sure you're providing as much as possible. So those are some things the state does not allow us to do. They also don't give us that much funding for rental assistance or affordable housing. And frankly, you know, Austin, we passed a record affordable housing bond at $250 million, but only years before that, an affordable housing bond had actually failed. So on one hand, I don't want to put it all on the state because there's things that the city could be doing better. And in fact, we have moved in that direction. So there was an affordable housing bond that failed. This is before the current 10-1 council. And then another one was presented at a lower number and that one passed. Asking for the 250 number was, we didn't know, you know, what voters were going to do. And thankfully we did the right thing because as we start to see more evictions and gentrification happening, our city has recognized that it's important to invest. But I will say that there's, aside from just like rent control, there's things that the state can do in providing better healthcare and instituting a minimum wage that's not $7.25 an hour. I know the economics are that there are not a lot of jobs, that most jobs really, especially in Austin, are not going to start at $7.25, but there are ones that still start at $7.25 or lower for people who don't feel they're in a position, are undocumented community, that feel they're in a position where they don't have a choice. They need a job, they need to support their family, they take a job at this low rate. And I think many times those kinds of families are taken advantage of. And the number one reason, my understanding, for people like families going bankrupt, including probably getting evicted, is a health issue. So because we haven't provided people with affordable health care in our state, in our country, you know, that stuff just starts to accumulate, gets to a point where you are choosing between paying rent or paying for your insulin. And so while there are the smaller, you know, in-depth ways for us to try to protect tenants specific to property laws and state laws in relation to that, there's also the broader things that are important to giving people basic access to healthcare and access to good paying jobs and access to good educational opportunities. And the fact that we base most of the state bases so much of its revenue on property taxes. You know, our state likes to proudly say that we don't have an income tax here, but then it's just a moving around of numbers in another way. And so, you know, for tenants, their landlord has to be able to cover whatever the property tax of that. And then, you know, obviously if they still are paying a mortgage on it aside from the property tax, but we really need to restructure our property tax laws because families are paying a significant portion. And then we also know that that doesn't even necessarily go to school districts as it should. There's a huge percentage of that we're told goes to school districts that in fact doesn't go to school districts. So there's all kinds of different ways that we could, our government could provide better opportunities to keep families in their homes.
Absolutely. I mean, that in your response alone, there's so much to unpack there, but you did a great job of really showing us how interconnected affordability is with many issues. And so one thing that we haven't talked about in detail yet is, so Shauna, if you could talk about what resources do you provide to help individuals who need assistance in navigating this process and to avoid homelessness?
Sure. Next slide, please. So BASA has developed a number of materials. We've been trying to make them as accessible as possible because we know everything is super confusing. And so we have a lot of different educational flyers. We even have some TikToks, which are educational and fun. And you can find them all at basaAustin.org/COVID-19. You also can follow us on social media channels to see the latest stuff that we put out. Next slide. And so One question which people often have is what happens if I know my landlord's violating city ordinances or county, well, this would be city ordinances. The mayor's order is city ordinance on giving you 60 days to repay rent. And so if that happens, right now you should call 311. And you can also, we have a Google form, you can report it to us on, and we can investigate, but calling 311 is going to be your best bet. And also know that your landlord can't even proceed with the eviction until July 22nd. And if your landlord does proceed, you would have, if the notice to vacate is illegal, you would have a defense to that eviction. And so that's kind of what you can do on the individual level. Next slide.
All right. Anything else, Shoshana, that you wanted to add to that, or?
I was going to talk about Eviction Solidarity Network, but I think we put that as a later.
That's right. We'll do that in our closing remarks.
Exactly.
Because I think that's a great way to get people involved. So we do have one question that has come through from our online audience. Question that we have is, wouldn't rent control of properties built on community land trust be an option?
Yes, they would. That is one of the exceptions to rent control, is community land trusts. And I know that the $250 million bond was also, there's buckets of that, and some of that was to create more of those kinds of community land trust ability. And in fact, that's how the one of the affordable housing programs in Miller, for example, is similar, but that's a more home ownership, and it's a special kind of equity build. So you're able, it says my battery is about to go down, sorry. It allows you to build a little bit of equity, but not in the more traditional way. And so then when you sell, it also, those homes are supposed to. So there are programs available that you can implement rent control, but not if it's outside of a kind of a community land trust situation. If it's just like, a lot of our landlords are people who own 2 or 3 rental houses. We cannot force that person to only, to limit how they can raise their rent. So more in the traditional sense of rent control, we cannot do.
Gotcha. All right, we're getting a lot of comments from our online audience that today's session has been super informative. Thank you. All right, so now we are on to closing remarks. Mayor Pro Tem, do you have any additional thoughts that you'd like to share with our Del Valley community?
Sure. Again, thank you, for this opportunity. And again, this pandemic has just magnified some systematic inequities that have existed for a very long time. And it's the silver lining is that we are addressing those. These are issues that myself and other council members who have a similar situated district have been advocating for. The reality is those districts do not make up a majority of all the districts. And so it's important for us to continue to this momentum that we're seeing in paying attention to equity and paying attention to areas that have been neglected is this momentum we need to build. And so there's so many people that are newly engaged to local politics, and I'm incredibly excited about it. So I would say, please stay engaged, please stay involved. I had this sign up here. This is my office number, 512-978-2102. If you have any questions, if there's any way that my office can be of assistance. If we can't directly help you or provide a city resources, we can point you in the right direction. Also, 311. If you can't remember that long number, 311 is a complaint-driven process. And so our community does not call 311 like other communities do. And they're actually incredibly responsive when we use them. And so call 311, whether it's a pothole, whatever the issue is, community issues, call 311. And just lastly, I'll say, housing is absolutely a human right. And there's so much work to be done at all levels of government to create more funding, not just to create, unfunded mandates or unfunded programs that were, oh, great, that's a great program, but where's the money? Where's the money that we can do it? Last thing, kind of off topic, but not really, because as I mentioned, this pandemic has greatly affected our Latino community significantly at disproportional rates. And I just ask you to please wear your mask. If you can stay home, stay home. Wearing a mask is not a substitute for social distancing. And even if you don't feel sick, it doesn't mean you don't have it. There are a lot of asymptomatic families. So please stay safe and stay home. If you can, wear your mask if you're out, and reach out to my office. And lastly, just thank you to the Del Valle Coalition for providing this forum. And as
Oh, I think we lost our Mayor Pro Tem. She did mention that her battery was low. But in the meantime, let's go over to Shoshana for some closing remarks. I think you have a great opportunity to get involved for our community.
Yeah, so it seemed like the Mayor Pro Tem's battery died just at the right moment as she was signing off. So good timing. So first, thanks so much to Del Valle Community Coalition for having us on tonight. A really informative conversation. And I guess I would, in terms of closing remarks of an individual tenant who right now is struggling, my first comment would be breathe. There's still some time. And there are protections which give you time. There's a lot of folks in this community who are working to try to keep you housed, to help you be able to remain housed. And so use those resources, contact us in Tenants Council, contact Texas Rio Grande Legal Aid. There are folks out there who stand with you. And then on that note, BASA is part of the Eviction Solidarity Network, which is a coalition with Austin Tenants Council, Democratic Socialists of America, Texas Housers, Austin Justice Coalition, and Planning Our Communities. And we are working to keep that eviction curve flat and prevent a second public health crisis. And we stand in solidarity with everyone who is facing evictions. And so some of the things that we're doing right now, and you can check out what we're doing at basaustin.org/evictions. It has all of this there. But we are raising awareness of what's going on by using Zoom background. So if you're in a lot of Zoom meetings, you can download a background and then just use it all the time because it's really fun. You can change your Facebook profile pic, and then you can sign up to witness cases and volunteer to observe and track court proceedings. And that's on pause right now because courts are on pause. But in the first wave, we witnessed over 100 hearings together. And judges, we showed up on Zoom and judges noticed, and you started calling us her esteemed guests. And so it makes a difference. And it's also, as the Mayor Pro Tem said before, it's also bearing witness to something which is a really violent act. And saying that this is not something which should be stigmatized. This is part of a larger systemic problem. This isn't an individual problem. And because it's not an individual problem, we need systemic solutions. And so the world doesn't need to be the way the world is. And part of what ESN is doing is raising awareness of that and saying that we are in solidarity and what is happening is not right.
Absolutely. And I highly recommend, I've also been able to volunteer with the witness the proceedings, and I highly recommend it to anyone who wants to learn more and to bear witness. All right, so this leads us to the conclusion of today's session. Thank you all so much for joining us. We love the engagement. We hope you found this as informative as we did. And certainly want to give a big thank you to our special guest, Mayor Pro Tem Delia Garza, to Shoshana Krieger with Basta Austin, and also want to give a shout out and a huge thank you to our DVCC tech support, Tina Byram, and our DVCC moderator, Susanna Woody, who are behind the scenes helping out throughout this entire time. Again, many thanks. If you have a suggestion of what topic you'd like our community coalition to cover, please reach out, let us know. We will be in touch in the next few weeks with any upcoming events. Thanks, everyone.